This is Caffeinated Risk, the monthly podcast for security professionals by security professionals, focused on the principles of enterprise security risk management, exploring technology and business management issues and how they relate to information security risk. Once a month, two self-proclaimed grumpy security guys bring you analysis, insights, and interviews with leading security risk professionals to learn how they work through a project, a program, or their careers using a risk-based approach to security. Now here are your hosts, Tim McCreet and Doug Leese.
Thanks, everyone, and welcome to our next podcast for Caffeinated Risk. Our guest for this month's session is Alex Martonik. He's a global industry specialist in financial services and insurance with Esri. And he's got a pretty amazing background, and Doug and I are looking forward to the podcast this month. So, Alex, thanks for joining the podcast. We really appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I'm gonna let Doug start, and then I got some really cool questions I want to ask. So we're gonna let Doug start.
I was come up with these weird ideas up front. So when I look at your signature, it indicates that it's tied into financial services and insurance, and we're hearing a lot about cybersecurity insurance as a risk management option, and I hear pluses and minuses and all that kind of stuff, but I think you're the first person we've ever had on that's in that industry that is doing this. So enlightening us a little bit on what exactly what the pluses and the minuses are of that whole strategy of using insurance as a risk mitigator.
No, absolutely. And, you've noted this. I have a very non-traditional background when we're looking at, the audience here, but it's because the risks that we're facing are not the same risk. That's not the traditional risks that we've been seeing for the past 20, 30 years or so. And cyber is quickly emerging. But you see, here's where I come in with my background. I have a background in national cybersecurity studies, and this was a part of a consortium program that was sponsored here in the United States by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And I did a lot of work focusing on critical infrastructure protection. Mm-hmm. And so when I look at cybersecurity, I start at the physical level first. And if we're talking about the physical level, every risk, every peril, that occurs at a place in space and time.
Yeah.
Now, while I was in that consortium program thinking that I'm training to be an all-source analyst, I'm going to make a career somewhere in civilian intelligence or within the military, I took this elective course, and it was for this technology called GIS, Geographic Information Systems. And I'd never heard of it before, but I wanted to just explore more, really broaden. I want to be an all-source analyst. I need to know all sources of intelligence coming in, including geospatial. And here I'm at 23, I'm making maps in the geography department. My colleagues around me are doing watershed analysis. They're looking at wildfires, soil suitability. And here I am making maps about ISIL and the spread of ISIL across the Euphrates and ethno-political boundaries and how that all related to military strategy and intelligence. And what I found was I could write this 8-page intelligence report, right, talking about the situation, or I can make one map. And I could speak to that map for hours talking about the context for the decision makers that they needed to understand behind the situation. So that was my entrance into geospatial intelligence. But that cyber risk, I start at that physical level because, again, one of the greatest risks in cyber are still perils that a lot of cybersecurity professionals don't consider. Mm-hmm. Things like climate change, right? Things like the physical risks to the grid itself, to the networks, to the nodes, to the server farms. So really, when I look at this from an insurance or financial perspective, it's about the investments first. Where do you proactively invest in areas that are less likely to be exposed to emerging physical perils first? So I've always been able to think about it from the perspective of the physical risks, working then with the cyber teams who kind of think in the zeros and the ones, and then communicate the financial impacts to the executives. And that's really the key part.
That's so cool. Because that's the space that we're trying to change the view of the profession of security and get people to look at this from an all hazards perspective or from an all risk perspective, is this idea that we've got, and actually I like what you brought up, Alex, because it rings back to what Doug and I years ago when we were doing reviews of data centers. where to put them, where to design them, how to secure them so that the systems that are housed inside the DC was actually secure. So we started similar to what you've done is we did the hard, the hard tour of a brick and mortar facility to figure out, is this the best place to put the racks for the data center? And is it close to a train station? That's probably not a great idea. Is it in the flight path for an airport? Yeah, probably not a great idea either. You want to put it somewhere else. So it's really cool that you're doing that, but from a GIS perspective, to look at it from that lens, man, that sure would have beat the hell out of how long we took to actually do a physical walk around of the facility and a tour of the neighborhood. And then I'm going to drive into the facility, as opposed to, couldn't I just look at it on a map, or couldn't I look at it from that perspective? I think that's really cool that you're taking that lens and applying it, and then even applying stuff, like what you're doing right now within your company is this concept of location intelligence as well. I think that's a really cool approach. Yeah,
I'm assuming that the mapping that we're talking about now is similar to Google Earth kind of thing, but more detailed, because you actually get to see what's under the street and all that kind of stuff too, or?
It's about the contextualization of the underlying data. And there's this movie, What We Do in the Shadows, produced in New Zealand, about vampires. The reason I bring this up is within the GIS community, there's this line that is quoted very often, which was, it's like Google, but with layers. When we're talking about GIS versus a product like Google Maps or Bing Maps, it's the layers on top of it. It's that context you can add. And let me give you a quick example, because this is one of my passions outside of the cyberspace is business resilience. And one of the best examples I've seen of resilience happened about 18 months ago. This was AT&T here in the United States working alongside Argonne National Labs utilizing Esri technology. And they wanted to examine all of the physical perils to AT&T's entire physical infrastructure and physical grid between now and 2050. Because executives understand that the impacts of climate change don't just magically manifest themselves on January 1st of 2050. There's going to be a lot in between now and then. And so they really took this from the approach of, what are the top 8 perils in the United States? How can we then craft a hyper-local analysis down to about 30-meter resolution grid? So to break that down, that means that for every 90 feet or so, there is a risk value for that segment of land in the standardized grid. They then overlaid that on a layer of their existing grid, and then they could prioritize it. It's funny because in risk management, if an executive comes in to say, what's the potential impact of this event, they're met a lot with, it depends. But in this case, they're met with, in this situation, here is the risk that we're facing to our infrastructure. Here's the dollar amount. But now you mentioned my finance background. Here's where I really see the space moving from risk being a cost center to a competitive advantage. Doing the analysis to show, hey, if we invest X amount of money into safeguarding this critical node now, that could save us, that can pay dividends down the line when these events do manifest. And so that's that spatial focus, that location intelligence, but looking at from resilience, how to proactively invest in hardening that infrastructure. They did this for the entire US. That's not a big data problem. That's a massive data problem. And so through that spatial lens, you can see that risk. It's not about just the risk scores. You see where the exposures are and where you need to put the money.
You're right. Even though it's cyber, it has to have a place that it occurs before the lights really go on.
And I think that's the point, right? Is that we talk about this, and we've had this discussion with other guests, and it still is this perception that everything's in a vacuum, and it's not, right? And it's trying to get that message across that from a resilience perspective, you need to look at the totality of the picture. You can't just take bits and pieces of it. Or my favorite, well, we got firewalls and antivirus, we got to be safe and secure. Really? Because it's a little more complex than that. And as soon as you get into the discussion with executives, their eyes glaze over and they start grabbing their phone and start looking for stuff to do. But it sounds like it's a really interesting approach that you guys take with this storyboard. Like, I'm really curious to see how you guys prepare, get ready for, and how do you get that story to the point where an executive who probably doesn't understand the full picture, when they come out of that briefing with you, or they see what that end result is, how do they embrace that, or how does their mindset change after you've had a chance to go through that story with them?
I think this all comes down to, right now, there is a fundamental shift in business culture among executives when it comes to risk, whereas 10 years ago, risk may have just been seen as a cost center. right? Something that is necessity, it's a must-have, but it's not really a key business value. We're now seeing this changing perception of risk, security, continuity, and resilience as the umbrella for all of it as critical business functions. And we can't lose sight of the fact of what is the main purpose of a business. It's to drive value and to drive growth. So whereas 10 years ago, I can imagine there would have been a lot of resistance to this type of insight into risk and vulnerability, executives are waking up to the fact that, hey, listen, we can't just grow our way out of these challenges anymore. It's not enough that you can just increase your output next year or make it up in sales in Q3. No, you're being constantly hammered by concurrent disruptions and events. You can't just insure your exposure away because insurance companies are now mandating that you step up and have more resilient practices and more sustainable practices. So it's really welcome in terms of how it can be communicated and understood again. That's why I love the map and the location view. When I first got introduced to GIS, I was really fortunate. I got to see former Governor Martin O'Malley give this talk about when he became governor and he utilized location intelligence to understand where they had assets in real time in his state. He called this the show me my house line of thinking. Any one of us, whether it's Google or Bing or Esri software, when you first open up a digital map, what do?
Oh, you go to your house. Sure, you type in your address and you want to see your house, right? Yeah.
You want to see your house. You want to see your coffee shop, somewhere that makes sense. And we all understand our world around us from the perspective of location and geography. You don't have to be a geographer or a map maker, but think about when you woke up this morning and you saw the temperature outside or the conditions. I know it's snowy where you are. It was pretty much sunny here in Southern California. We know when we have to leave for work. We know, hey, if I want to get a cup of coffee, I'm going to leave at this time because traffic. Think about all of the complexity real quick in that decision. It would be almost impossible for a computer to tell you, you need to leave Tim and Doug at this time. We intuitively understand it. So that's where this is really well received of executives. They go, hey, I understand that context now on an intuitive level. I don't have to read a 10-page report and figure out what's the difference between a 6.8 and a 7.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah, because most executives won't, right?
Yeah, we talked about that in the last episode as well, that getting it into the right buckets of concern was more important than the final decimal point, because there's never enough money to do all the things. There's never enough people to do all the things.
I'll be the first to say in 2019, I was at GSX.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of skepticism still about the idea of business resilience.
Sure.
Now, fast forward 4 months in March of 2020, it's a completely different story around business resilience being a competitive advantage.
Absolutely.
A value driver in a business. So I wanted to send those. I wanted to see, like, hey, where are you seeing right now resilience taking hold in the industry?
Yeah, for sure. My day job is in oil and gas, and so physicality is a very real thing, and the risk around those things is, environmental impacts, physical harm to people, and things like that. But I just wanted to circle back here. I love the term democratizing risk insights to non-risk professionals. I think that's almost trademarkable. Maybe it is. Other than the map so that people can contextualize where this is going to happen, have you found in your work other ways to help people that are still getting concepts like risk and vulnerability and threat mixed up in their head? How do you help them put that formula together in a way that, like you said, democratize? You don't need to spend 6 years in the business to really get some of these concepts.
Oh, yeah, this is what's wonderful about the map. The map doesn't care about the vernacular. The map doesn't care about the jargon. Anything can be jargony, right? I could talk about the threat landscape and someone could say there's benefits to this threat landscape that has, social and political risk all the way to climate risk. We can talk about convergence. To a lot of people, that sounds like jargon. Mm-hmm. But when we're talking about the map and democratizing the risk insights, what I'd like to say about that is it's helping non-risk business functions like business development or merchandising for a retail operation or store operations, getting them to embed risk insights early on in their strategy without them having to worry about the vernacular, without having to understand, enterprise security risk management as a project management framework, right? A good example, we were working with this retailer during COVID-19, and you may have seen the Johns Hopkins dashboard, right? That was tracking COVID-19 across the world.
Yep, every night. Yeah, it was on every night, right, during the pandemic. Yeah, we saw it every night. You betcha. Yeah.
Everyone saw it every night. It was on every news station, had over 1 trillion views in that first year, and that was built on Esri technology.
Oh.
Johns Hopkins, working alongside us, published that out. In every county here in the United States, for the most part, I saw different variations, but there was still that authoritative dashboard coming in. We were working with a retailer, and the chief security officer at this retailer who wanted to stand that up so that they can understand from a duty of care perspective where their employees might be at risk. But this was the beautiful thing I saw once the dashboard was live in the GSOC. This officer went out and did a little roadshow with all of his counterparts in business development, in sales operations, in merchandising, and supply chain to say, this is how the virus is impacting your operations so that you can make those business decisions before you feel that impact coming in. And the quote he gave us was that everyone is at a different point in time in the timeline of this virus. And all of that is tied to geography. So this retailer was making store operations decisions at a hyper-local level based on the insights coming from the GSOC. And I had never heard of a GSOC funneling that level of business growth before.
Wow.
They were trying to get a hold of their vendors and suppliers to say, we are selling this type of product in these areas. We've noticed now there's a trend between a particular product or brand and the increase in cases in an area. There's a high correlation. But again, this was all coming from the SOC.
That's an amazing example, because I wanted to ask this. To me, this feels like it's a true support of the concept of ESRM, where we're really identifying what's the risk and the decision that the business has to make based on the data that's provided. So, like, are you seeing more of that? Are you starting to see businesses starting to embrace this concept of enterprise security risk management, even if it's not being called that when it's being presented? Are you starting to see now where we're hoping this fundamental shift in the way that businesses are looking at the role that security plays in an organization, and how you guys are supporting that? Because that GSOC example is pretty amazing to see that kind of detail, that kind of business decisions coming out of a GSOC. Are you seeing more of that or did you see lots of it at scale during the pandemic as well? I'm just curious to see how that link to ESRM is working for you folks.
No, certainly. And you're exactly right. A lot of organizations are waking up to this idea without calling it ESRM. And again, with my unique background, I service our users within the financial services space and insurance. And on the insurance side, I've been a licensed insurance professional for almost 10 years now. I think in risk. That's just how my mind naturally will gravitate towards a situation. And we're seeing the same thing within the insurance industry, not focusing on the risks, but understanding that there is no new normal. Everything's going to be volatility and chaos. It's the opportunities that are going to come from that. And a lot of retailers are looking at, again, resilience as a competitive advantage, because the pandemic perfectly highlighted that regardless of brand loyalty, when necessity comes to the door, people will gravitate towards whoever can fulfill upon the goods and services that they need. So the retailer we were working with, they did fairly well during the pandemic because they were able to meet those needs. And so from this competitive advantage perspective, we are seeing now where it's not just where risk professionals are being sat at the table, it's risk professionals are teaching the business professionals how to think that way. Kind of a tertiary part of my background, I have an MBA in finance. And so looking at the financial implications, if you're looking at direct foreign investment into any country, there are all these formulas you utilize to look at currency risk, interest rate risk, in some cases, a little bit of political risk, but never the physical risk. So for decades, organizations were putting in new facilities, either for production or warehousing or what have you, and they didn't consider the physical risk because they transferred that to an insurance company.
Right.
And now it's coming right back to them. That risk is being transferred back to say, you have to do your due diligence. So enterprise security risk management, especially among COOs and CFOs, is really gaining traction. I see a great opportunity for the CSO to be a trusted advisor there and a partner. Well, two things have had to happen to make this. And the first is really the risk catching up to the business processes. And the second, the technology being able to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd like to just share kind of a funny, it's not related to risk, but it kind of is. And I think it's the picture of why this is the time. I used to go fishing with my dad every year in Alaska for about a month or so. We'd catch the sockeye run outside of Kenai. And one of my uncles who lived up there came to our door one day and says, "Hey, we're going to go halibut fishing. Come on out." So we get in the car at 4 a.m, drive out to the coast. We put the little tote master in the water, and we then proceed to sail for about an hour and a half, middle of the ocean. And we're out there with our lines in the water, and suddenly we notice the water is coming up to our shoes. And we're like, "Oh, it's raining, but not that much. That's strange." Well, when the water got to our ankles, we started to get concerned, and come to find out, my uncle forgot to put the drain plug back in the boat. So he guns it in full speed, and we start bailing the water. And the funny thing was, this boat, he had life jackets in it, right? But contextually, would those life jackets have done anything to us? Hour and a half in the middle of nowhere of the ocean, water is pretty frigid. The reason I bring this up is my uncle, the year before for Christmas, got an emergency life raft from his wife to put in the back of the boat for situations like this. It was not in the boat because, and I quote, "we wouldn't have as much room for fish."
There you go. Oh, man.
And that, to me, early on in my life, has highlighted the business understanding of risk for far too long. We have some contingencies. We have some redundancies. We have the safeguards. We got the locks, the cameras, the guards. But is that suitable for the risk?
Yes.
If the ship goes down, it didn't matter how many fish were in it. We needed to put that raft in so that we could get out of it. And that's climate change. That's cyber. 20 years ago, cybersecurity was not what it is today, where I think it was Yahoo, the data breach cost around $223 million in terms of its hit to their market capitalization. One event, $223 million. Yeah, physical security could not have helped that. That's where I like convergence coming in. I know convergence is still really contentious in some groups. Some people want more of the specialization. Others think it's going to get rid of stovepiping of information. I think convergence can be done well enough to where that chief security officer becomes that chief resilience officer. And yeah, then they're the trusted partner.
If we're talking convergence of function, and I seem to be losing this argument this month, but it's early in the month. But
it's early. I was going to say it's early, man. This is early.
It's not looking good for this month either. But, to me, it seems like when we're measuring roughly the same things but have different lenses on them, maybe it makes more sense to gather once and get different groups to look at the same stuff. They're looking at it in different ways. Doesn't matter what you call it, data lake, data swamp. A fact is a fact. And if we spent less time worrying about the tools to collect that, to make sure that each team had their stuff, and more of that money on more people that can interpret that data in their relative skills. I'm not saying every cyber forensics person is going to be excellent at figuring out geopolitical stuff. Like, you still need the experts in that area, but we're all gathering about the same information. And if there was just ways that we could get it in one spot, then maybe we converge at the data layer instead of worrying about interchanges between tools and things like that. How do you see that?
No, that's a great way of looking at it. And I do have one customer, I'm going to say that they are remaining nameless, but they're approaching convergence, I think, better than anyone else I've worked with. And when you look at the physical layout of where they handle all things risk, all things resilience, they have co-located every team there, from cyber to threat intelligence to continuity, from enterprise risk management. And when you first walk in, you're greeted in the GSOC. And the GSOC is the front and center in terms of the gatekeepers of the real-time information and the real-time data that's coming through. But let me back up what location intelligence really is at the end of the day. I know we have a couple point solutions I talked about, the story maps, for example. That's a dissemination tool. We have other things like business analysts that are utilized on the sales side, that's on the market development side, that they use that for customer analytics. All these are within the same suite. Location intelligence at the end of the day is a data framework. Regardless of the lake or the swamp, as you've mentioned, location intelligence as a framework sits directly on top of that. And it's about contextualization. It's about integrating disparate streams of data and adding the context that makes it more intuitive to understand. And from there, the core team that manages that framework, they're publishing out a series of authoritative location services to all of these teams so that the end business unit, whether it's the GSOC, whether it's threat intelligence, they're able to utilize the same data without having to manipulate and worry about the underlying data infrastructure. They're creating the views that make sense to them.
Yeah.
So it's a way of democratizing the data while still preserving and siloing the specialization. And then when everyone needs to work together, they can publish off that copy, that clone of the view, and send it over. So if the GSOC notices, hey, there's this pattern that's coming in one of our facilities, do you see anything in threat intelligence? They can take that snapshot. They can curate that, directly send it over to threat intelligence, and they can do a more long-term qualitative assessment of what that might be going on there. And this is really at the core of what business resilience is. You know, Tim, you mentioned this. I think for the longest time, part of the disconnect in the C-suite was that business resilience was one thing. Right. See, business resilience has never been one thing. It's being used as jargon now, post-pandemic, but it's a series of overlapping and continuous workflows that work in tandem to one another. It's all the way from security operations, incident management, special event management, executive protection, all the way up to the group that's doing that business continuity assessment. So location intelligence is really just that single sheet of music that everyone in the orchestra can play from.
Wow. Yeah. Again, I go back to had we had this 10 years ago, our life would have been a little easier, right? Because there was not the commitment. Well, I'll take a step back. I kind of want to ask a question about maturity as we move into this. And you're seeing, as part of the team, you stood this up in 2017, you moved forward. So in the past 5 years, you've seen what sounds like some great maturity and this growth within the executive suite and the ability for a chief or a chief information security officer to see the value of this. And then, recently, as you've gone to GSX and you've heard the ESRM story and this concept of a risk-based approach to security, where do you see the team, and where this part of the industry and this profession that we're focusing on, where do you see this in 5 to 10 years? Like where the additional value that you're going to bring to security programs or security professionals, where do you see that happening in the next 5, 10 years?
Doug, you mentioned earlier about the headcount and whether or not it's a matter of less technology and more analysts coming in. And I definitely see where there will be that investment towards increasing security budgets overall and headcount. But I'm wondering if there is, in 5 to 10 years, a new version of what that security professional looks like. If I had the budget now and I was investing in creating a top tier resilient strategy and I wanted to add headcount, I might not be putting all that headcount in the GSOC. That's great. You only need so many operators and analysts and managers to look at what's happening and being able to interpret the automated alerts. But what about the consultants now? What's that next generation of risk and resilience professionals who are going to be embedding themselves with traditionally non-risk focused operations, whether again, it could be within supply chain, but supply chains always had their risk management professionals, and I love them because they think very similar to me. But we're seeing this in insurance now too, where it's not just the traditional insurance professional. They look like all source intelligence. They look like what I was trained to do for those, acronymed agencies. They're coming in and they are going to managing directors, not just the C-suite, but they're doing these internal roadshows horizontally to managing directors to say, based on what we have from these different risks and threats, it's that ESRM like you talked about, Tim. They're doing that now at a more organic level so that the strategies that come up don't just have risk at the tail end giving their piece. Risk was embedded in the beginning. They're understanding that because, again, any type of market development strategy has always brought in those traditional financial risks, the interest rate risk, the currency risk, all of those things because they directly impacted the bottom line. Risk now has that impact. And so that's where I see the next 5 to 10 years. It's, hey, the resilience officer is going to have those consultants. I won't have to go to these companies. They'll have someone that's trained already to go and do that.
Agreed. And I think that's where I like where the discussion has come around to is that we started with risk and we ended up with the perception of how we deal with risk from a customer's lens as well. I'm going to try to end this on a high note. I think what we've really shown is this idea that you can apply the principles of risk and risk management and really truly present to the business the decision they need to make, right? Within the ESRM model, when we start and end with the business, I think that's the actual picture description of what we need to do in an ESRM-based program. So I just want to say thanks, Alex. I think this was really cool to have you come on and to talk about what you and the folks at Esri have done. And I think there's this groundswell change now in how we want to take a look at risk from that lens and that perspective, and that the technology is there not only to collect the data, but to present it in a way that how can you not make a business decision. So I just want to say thanks, man. This was great having you on the podcast this month. So thank you for that.
Likewise, pleasure's all mine. I could do this all day with you too. I really appreciate it. Leveraging your experience as well. So hopefully get to see you sometime soon at GSX in person.
Absolutely. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for listening to the latest podcast from Caffeinated Risk. Make sure you visit our website, caffeinatedrisk.com, to stay up to date on what we've been working on. Our website has bios of our podcast guests, posts about topics we're passionate about, and even a library of reference material we find valuable in the work we do every day. And don't forget to subscribe to Caffeinated Risk on your favorite podcast service. This way, you'll be notified when we release our next podcast, and you can listen to our previous guests just in case you missed them. Thanks so much for listening to Caffeinated Risk.